Hey, welcome everybody. This is Tony. We're glad to have you here. In fact, today's conversation, there must be a lot of interest because we had the largest registration we've ever had for one of our webinars. And the topic today, if you're just wondering why are we watching Tony talk on a video screen today, it's all about engagement. And engagement is kind of one of those new buzzwords that we're hearing as we're working with churches across the country and reading articles about what other churches are doing. And we're suspecting you have some questions about that. Otherwise, you wouldn't be with us today. And specifically, what we're going to be talking about is, first of all, defining engagement. What is engagement really about? And then some strategies to increase engagement. And then finally, we're going to try to give you some guidance on, are we actually hitting the mark when it comes to engagement as well? In fact, we're going to be focusing on these four specific topics throughout our conversation today. We're going to be looking at two types of engagement that you should be monitoring. Secondly, we're going to look at what data is telling us about benchmarks and trends in engagement. And that part of our conversation is the result of some research that we did several months ago on this very topic. Third, we're going to talk about the role of digital engagement, because it's not just about engaging people in our physical locations. It's also about how we're engaging with people, in some cases, before they even become first-time guests at our churches. And finally, we're going to talk about how to know whether or not we're winning in this area. Now, today I'm joined by two of my friends. They're actually partners with me at the Unstuck group. First of all, let me introduce Sean Bublitz. Sean, wave, say hello. Actually, you have to say hello, otherwise people don't know you.
That's right. That's right. Hey, Tony, looking forward to the conversation today.
And Sean's important because in addition to being a part of our conversation, he's going to be facilitating some of the discussion so that I can actually answer some of the questions that we have on this very topic. But Sean has a rich ministry background, spent 12 years serving in leadership roles in two great churches, Community Christian Church near Naperville, Illinois, and Granger Community Church near South Bend, Indiana. And he's been with our team for several years. In fact, if you're engaging in one of our online courses, you've probably interacted with Sean because he really helps us with digital engagement as well. And then Amy Anderson is going to be on the panel. You have to say hello, Amy.
Hello, my friend. Hello from Minnesota today.
Amy looks like she's ready to record a podcast, and you probably know Amy from the Unstuck Church podcast. We get to do it every week. We get to talk about trends, activities, things that we're seeing across the church in America and beyond. And so, Amy, I'm glad that you get to partner with me on the podcast. But even more so, I'm glad you're part of our team. She's the director of consulting for the Unstuck group. But before that, served at Eagle Brook Church up in the Twin Cities area. She was the director over weekend services for 12 years, helped the church grow from 3,000 to over 20,000 in multiple locations. And she just has a wealth of knowledge and experience when it comes to the church. And because she's working with churches on a weekly basis across the country, this topic of engagement, she's very familiar with that as well. So that's who's going to be having the conversation today. And Sean, the topic is all about engagement. So we should probably talk about how participants in today's webinar can also engage the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Great transition. So we're going to leave some time toward the end of today's webinar for Q&A. And Mark Meyer from our team, he's going to be answering your questions live on chat and throughout the webinar. And he's going to help us choose some of those questions to respond to during the Q&A at the end. So for any that we can't get to live, we'll plan to answer some of those in the follow-up content as well. We're also having a conversation over on social media. So throughout the webinar, you can share your questions and comments on Facebook and Twitter. Just use the hashtag UnstuckChurch so that we can see those. All right, so let's get to the focus of today's webinar. We're going to spend the next hour discussing the hot topic of engagement in the church. There are obviously a lot of different ways a church could define engagement. You can't start increasing engagement until you know what you're trying to increase. So which of the definitions matter the most? Tony, I'll start with you. What's one of the most important types of engagement that you think all churches should be measuring?
Yeah, so we're going to hit two types of engagement that churches should be looking at. But the first type of engagement that I want you to think about, and honestly, as I'm hearing buzz around engagement in churches today, this is really a neglected form of engagement that we need to reprioritize. And what I'm talking about is our engagement with someone before they become a first-time guest at our church. Now, we're encouraging churches to think about this in two different ways. First of all, the priority ought to be helping us in the church, those of us that are already engaged at our churches, to recognize the importance of developing relationships with other people that are in our lives, that God has in our lives. They're friends, they're family members, they're coworkers, they're folks that we rub shoulders with in our social activities, hang out with at the ball fields, whatever that looks like. God has people in our lives that may not have a relationship with Jesus yet. And so the first part about increasing this type of engagement is just to encourage people to begin to develop relationships with people in their lives. And this may sound a little bit like, I can't believe we have to, as church leaders, teach people how to engage relationships. But I think this is part of the nature of the culture that we live in today. People are more isolated. I think social media has helped us be engaged socially, digitally. But in some ways, it has also, I think, created challenges for us in our physical worlds to develop relationships with people. And I actually think people in our churches need some coaching on how to do this. And one of the models that I've most appreciated through the years actually comes from the church that Sean worked with at Community Christian Church. Dave Ferguson, the pastor there, has talked about the bless model. And he talks at those, it's the 5 letters, BLESS. And they're used to prompt us to think about these 5 ways that we begin to develop relationships with people. We begin with prayer. We listen to their stories. We eat with them, which is one way. We just socialize. We hang out with people. We really serve them. We listen to their stories and then we serve them where we can. And then we share our story about what Jesus is doing in our lives. And the great thing about that model is it makes it real practical, real hands-on, how we can begin to develop relationships with people. And it ends with us sharing our story. We don't need to know a specific roadmap of Bible passages and so on to share our faith. We can just share what Jesus has done in our lives. And that's a real effective way to begin to engage with people in our lives before they may even become guests at our churches. But the second way that we need to be focusing on engagement before someone is a guest is with our content strategy as well. In other words, we need to be aware of the questions that people are asking before they even come to our churches, before they even consider a relationship with Jesus. And so, as you know, Sean, we have this thorough process at the Unstuck Group where we help churches define their mission field and to get really focused on who within that mission field the church is trying to reach. And then specifically, we begin to prioritize what are the key questions that those people are asking. And when churches have that type of focus, then it really does create an opportunity to develop a content strategy to try to address those specific questions. And so these are a couple of ways that we get at that very first type of engagement, which is engaging people before they become guests at our church.
Yeah, that's really good. So, Amy, if those people come and visit our church for the very first time, what about those second and third time guests? What should churches be measuring when it comes to getting those guests to return?
Yeah, well, let me just take a step back. Of course, if you think about it, returning guests really helps you measure the effectiveness of your weekend experience, because a first-time guest came for whatever reason, gave you an hour of their time to see if the church was a fit. And then if that connected with them, if it helped them, then they're assessing, was that investment of my time and energy worth it? And if the answer is yes, they're going to come back. So of course we want to be tracking that. And, you know, when we do secret shoppers at the churches, there's a lot of things that we track, but the bottom line question we always ask ourselves is, would I come back to this church, and would I bring a friend? And, you know, we only say yes with all the churches we've served only about 25% of the time. And for me, that indicates that a lot of our churches have front door issues with retaining guests. So I think the big question is, how do you get at that data? Because if people don't come back, they don't tell you that they were even here the first time. They just don't come back. And I wanted to reference an idea, Sean, that we just recorded on the podcast the other day. And that is, when people come to your church, even when I secret shop, they are kind of afraid to become known. And on that podcast that's coming out, you talked about a lot of digital strategies to help a guest identify that they maybe want some more information, but instead of sending them to a person or sending them to a booth where they don't know what you're going to ask of them or what they're committing to, you suggested, Sean, that we actually give them a text option just to kind of say, hello, you know, I was here, and to engage with them digitally first, so that in a sense the guest is in control of what's happening next. And you had suggested that we should send them a text that invites them to stop back when they come back at a booth or at an information desk, or to meet someone, but we're really clearly outlining what that experience will be like and what we're actually going to ask of them or tell them. And that strategy, putting both of those pieces together, I think sounds like a very effective way to begin to measure, did somebody come back on that weekend? It's something that you can track. So that's one idea for how to track second and third time guests.
Yeah, that's very good. Good promo for the podcast too. Excellent job.
Yeah.
That'll be coming out in just a couple of weeks, so we hope everybody is helped by that. So Tony, just transitioning back to you, is there another type of engagement that you really feel like churches must be measuring?
Yeah, I do. So the second type of engagement, and actually this is the type of engagement we hear more commonly churches talking about, is the engagement that happens after someone attends a service. In other words, we're trying to engage them again in relationships, but this time in relationships either through smaller groups, small groups, home groups, Bible studies, or through serving opportunities. And again, our data shows that when this happens, churches are healthier, they end up reaching more people for Jesus, and attendance actually grows as well, particularly when it comes to group participation, and then that just getting a certain level of volunteer engagement as well. So the common question then we hear from churches is, okay, if that's a priority, how do we measure that? Because churches have done a good job through the years of tracking and measuring attendance on Sunday morning or attendance at an event, giving, things like that. But it's much more challenging to measure group participation and serving engagement. And so rather than trying to do that on a weekly basis, like we measure attendance on Sunday mornings, I've encouraged churches, let's just look at it on a quarterly basis. Let's just survey our team leaders, our volunteer leaders, and our group leaders on a quarterly basis to find out who really is engaged in these different environments. And at least on a quarterly basis, we can then monitor what the trends look like for engagement. It's really not as important here for us to know every week who's participating. We're more concerned about whether or not that relational connection is happening in the long term. And so it really helps us then to at least look on a quarterly basis on where people are actually engaged. And that's the other coaching I would give here, is let's actually measure engagement, not signups. And so I've seen some churches highlight huge numbers of participation in groups, but in reality, it's just the number of people that signed up at the very beginning of a semester of group participation saying that they wanted to be in groups, but it doesn't measure whether or not they actually showed up for group and if they're still connected into a group. And so here, for it to truly be a measure of engagement, we need to look at how many people are showing up and actually participating and developing the relationships that those ministry environments are intended to address.
Yeah, that's excellent. Okay, so let's dive just a little deeper and talk about some specific benchmarks when it comes to engagement. We love data here at the Unstuck Group, and we love it so much. We actually recently released a survey of lots of different churches that we connected with on specifically their church engagement. So, Tony, I know a few of the results that we saw really underscore the importance of reaching more first-time guests, like we were just discussing a minute ago. But what are some of the specific front door benchmarks that we saw?
So let me back up for a second and share. We've shared this math before, but it's always surprising to folks when they hear this for the very first time. The reason why we talk about the need for first-time guests so much is because whether you realize it or not, there's a natural transition that's happening in every church. In fact, on average, we find that 15% of churches, people in your churches that were connected over the last 12 months, and the next 12 months won't be a part of your church. And what that means is if we want to experience growth in our churches, growth in the number of people we're reaching and growth in attendance, then we constantly have to be focused on reaching first-time guests. And what we're saying is that if you do have a great experience for first-time guests, a great worship experience, great guest services, great follow-up, great connection, you're likely going to retain 20% of your first-time guests that will eventually connect and be fully engaged in your church. And so it really does. It takes a lot of first-time guests not only to see growth, but to make up for the people that are transitioning away from your church for whatever reason. So all that then leading into some key stats that we found in the research we completed a few months ago. First of all, this one may be shocking to you. Let me make sure I read it to get it correct. 74% of growing churches had increases in first-time guests compared to only 23% of declining churches. And so here, specifically, increasing first-time guests, what we're seeing is there's a significant difference then between growing and declining churches. Here's another, this one shocked me. And it's probably going to surprise you as well. The average person attends services more frequently in declining churches than growing churches. And so, and by the way, it's if you average the two, it's about 2.5 weeks per month is what we're seeing when we looked at the research from all the churches that were a part of this research. But what was shocking to me is that there's actually higher frequency in growing churches, or I'm sorry, higher frequency in declining churches. I'm confusing myself with the math right now, than growing churches. And Sean, I have a couple of theories on why this might be the case. I do think that live streaming our services may reduce the frequency of people participating, especially if that live experience through the stream is done very well. But my suspicion is, and actually some of the other data we're going to talk about later suggests this as well, that when you live stream, it increases the number of first-time guests and it increases attendance overall is what we're seeing in the data. So that's one theory why I think that frequency number is really opposite of what you would expect. Secondly, when it comes to frequency, we do see the data again shows us that serving really matters when it comes to frequency. That should be no surprise to any of us. We want people to volunteer, not only because it's part of our discipleship strategy, it's part of our spiritual formation process, but as people engage in serving, they're more likely to show up on a more frequent basis as well. And so it's interesting to look at what some of the data is telling us when it comes to not only first-time guests and attendance growth, but the frequency of participation in our services as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Just staying along the same lines of serving, Amy, I found that the data on volunteers was another surprising metric in the survey. Moderate volunteer engagement is actually a sign of growth. 34% of declining churches indicated that they had more than half of their attendees volunteering once per month, but only 19% of growing churches had that high level of engagement. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, it seems probably a little bit counterintuitive. I see this all the time when I'm on the road with churches. And it goes back, Tony, to what you always said. There's no one metric that tells the overall story of the health of a church. And this is another one that just kind of fits into that picture. So when you have a lot of first-time guests, when we think about a healthy, growing church, we just kind of made the case that you've got a good front door, you've got people coming in. And if you think about it, what do new people not do? They're not in a group yet. They don't serve yet. They're probably not giving yet. And so if you have a healthy front door, that's actually going to bring your serving percentage down. So if your church is growing and your engagement numbers in serving is low, that actually is probably a good thing. It's actually telling you you've got a healthy front door, because churches that are seeing, upwards of 40, 50% of their people engaged in serving, often those are the churches where I see they're actually a little bit stuck, because they've got a very devout base. They've got regular attenders who have been coming for years, and they're plugged in and they're serving. So while we want to celebrate 70% of our people are serving, it might actually indicate, well, but you don't have any of those new folks who are actually offsetting that overall percentage. Tony, how'd I do there with the math? Was that good?
I'm pretty impressed, but Amy,
right.
I've seen you can make a mean spreadsheet, so I trust that you got it.
All right, so Tony, here's one that may be a hot button topic for some of the churches that are tuned in today. Almost half of the churches surveyed didn't have Sunday school at all, but the small group engagement numbers really stood out. How do you interpret the data on Sunday school and small groups?
Yeah, so this was fascinating. Again, let me make sure I get the stats correct for you. Small group participation increased in 74% of growing churches and only 33% of declining churches. And the connection there was more of those declining churches had Sunday school. So, we can go back and forth with the value of Sunday school. I've seen churches do it well, especially when it's not just about the teaching, but they're actually helping people in Sunday school format still develop relationships that go beyond Sunday morning. But what the data seems to be pointing to, is pretty obvious, is that small group participation is really key in growing churches and really helps with this topic of engagement. And if engagement really is about relational connection, both in the engagement before someone becomes a guest and then after they've attended our service, engagement is really about relationships. If that's the key, then it appears that small group participation is a better way of creating that relational connection than even the Sunday school model is concerned. So the obvious question then is, Tony, have you seen any best practices when it comes to small group participation and engagement? And I have some thoughts on that. Sean, you ready for that?
I'm not surprised, but I'm interested to hear that.
One thing that I'm observing, one strategy I'm observing is it's actually easier for churches to launch brand new groups than it is for churches to add new people to existing groups. And because of that, where we're seeing high levels of small group participation, churches get really intentional about at least twice a year, probably at the beginning of the school year, and then also right after the holidays, of offering brand new group opportunities for anybody in the church. Now, there's no doubt about it, that strategy really puts the demand on raising up small group leaders. And so you small group pastors and directors out there, you have your work cut out for you. But there does seem to be a higher level of engagement in those churches that are offering new group opportunities on a regular basis. Secondly, we're seeing high levels of small group participation when the group curriculum is actually designed to extend the conversation from the Sunday message that's being taught every week. And so when groups know that we're going to be talking and studying scripture based on the message from the previous Sunday, there also seems to be a higher level of engagement in small groups. And by the way, I think that naturally is going to help participation and higher level of frequency with engagement in your attendance on Sunday morning as well. And then finally here, I would suggest we've actually done quite a bit of work through the years in providing some small group resources, but none better than Chris Surratt. Chris is on our team, used to be with Seacoast Church in South Carolina. He has written a couple of books on small group participation, both for leaders and just generally for small groups in churches. And then we've done a couple of podcasts with Chris as well. And so I would encourage you to go back, listen to this podcast, read his books, a lot of great information for you if you want to engage and take a next step when it comes to your small group strategy in your churches.
Yeah. So my bet is that there are a lot of people who are tuned in today who are really curious about digital engagement specifically, all that stuff that happens online. Right now, it seems to be kind of the most mysterious element of engagement for pastors. So let's get into that for a little bit. Tony, I know that you have some passion around this topic in particular. Why do you think churches need a content strategy?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And it's because I think our digital presence, it really is the new front door for our churches. And I can't imagine in today's culture anybody visiting our churches before they first visit our websites, visit our Facebook pages, engage with what's happening online. I know I do that in my life if I'm going to experience something for the very first time. Major League ballparks is my hobby, and my son and I are finally going to get to go to Citi Field in New York to see
very nice
for the very first time.
Yeah.
But we're not just showing up blind. I've been all over the website to figure out where are the seats that I'm going to get, what time of day should we arrive before the ball game, where should I park, things like that. I mean, I've been all over the website before we visit Citi Field for the very first time. And in today's culture, that's just commonplace. That's where it's happening. And beyond just preparing for a visit, of course, we're also learning that it's this content strategy that prepares us to really engage with the people we want to eventually visit our churches and be a part of one of our services, actually be in our building and worshiping with us on Sunday morning. And so it really is essential that we think about not just streaming our services, though you should be doing that, but looking at how are we creating content, again, referring back to what I talked about earlier, is going to help us engage the people in our mission field that we're trying to reach as a church and really answering the questions that they're asking. And Sean, you've seen this. We're seeing churches use blogging, video, podcasting, obviously social media. I mean, they're trying to do everything they can to create a digital strategy to engage people. And the great thing about that type of engagement, it's easily measurable. There are all kinds of tools for us to know whether or not people are engaging with our content strategy. As a matter of fact, Sean, you shared some good news this morning about our engagement. What was that?
Yeah. Well, we set a new record for single day first day episode downloads on our podcast last week. So thanks to everybody out there who's engaging with our podcast.
That's good. Yeah. But anyways, many times now, before anybody would actually work with us when it comes to consulting with churches, they're engaging with our content. So I mean, we're not sharing with you a strategy that we're not seeing that's actually working for our ministry as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Amy, along the lines of digital engagement, one other thing that stood out to me was the difference in social media engagement between growing and declining churches. Facebook is increasing for both growing and declining churches, but Instagram is really where the big separation was that we saw. 44% of declining churches said that they're using Instagram, but 72%, almost 3 out of 4 growing churches are using Instagram. What do you think about that?
Well, first, I just want to send some kudos out there to whether you're growing or declining. I'm glad that our churches are trying some new things and they're getting out there and using it. And, social media, it doesn't surprise me. Growing churches are using Instagram maybe more successfully, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But, that's where the younger people are. I think if we think about Facebook versus Instagram, of course, the younger folks are going to be more on Instagram and looking around at it. But before I go to Instagram, Facebook is not passe. I think what you said is that both declining and we're seeing good results in both areas, right? Declining and growing churches using Facebook. It's still out there. People are still using it. It's just important to know what Facebook is good at. And Facebook is good at sharing things from your church, stories from your church, messages from your church, funny other things that they put out there. That's where people linger, and it's great for events, so people can click on that and go find that. Instagram is not good for that. And I think that's sometimes why churches aren't seeing the benefit of being on Instagram. Instagram is great for the human side, right, of church. So it's great for putting pictures out there. It's not a place to promote things. Like, we don't go to Instagram so we can see what sales are going on at Home Depot, right? That's not where we play.
Right.
And I think churches are still getting some of that tangled. My friend Ken Meyer, who's the founder and author of Less Chaos, Less Noise, just kind of said each social media outlet sort of has a job description, and they're not all the same. And so just encouraging churches, if you're using those strategies, great. I'm glad that you've stepped into it. Obviously, churches that are growing are using those very well. I would just take a step back and think through, how are you using them, for what medium? Maybe pause, retool, relaunch. But they're very effective in reaching folks if you use them right.
Yeah.
If I may add to, I think another reason why we're seeing Instagram being so effective is it reaches young adults, unlike Facebook. I mean, there are some adults that are on Facebook, but I know my young adults, as an example, they're never on Facebook. It's only Instagram or Twitter. And the Instagram, I think, it's just a powerful platform because pictures help tell a story, the story of what's happening in our lives. And for us today, the story of what's happening in our churches as well.
Yeah, I think if you think on Instagram, think human side, think stories, think pictures, think visuals. Don't think promo. Don't think down those other paths of maybe what you've thought about with social media.
Yeah. It's very good. The other thing I think we need to consider when we think of digital engagement within the church is our video content, how we're using video to engage people online. And many churches are using video, whether that's through live stream or on demand or YouTube or Vimeo or whatever. The data that we found in the survey was interesting. 85% of growing churches were using some sort of video digital strategy online, compared to just 49% of declining churches. So I love the fact that almost every single one of the growing churches that we encountered was using some sort of video strategy. The data that we looked at suggested that the video online, it might slightly reduce the frequency that people attend, because they do have that option while they're traveling or something, or if they're at home, to just watch online that day. But it likely increases the total number of people who attend your church. So here's what we're seeing commonly with this video strategy is it really serves two purposes for churches. One is it keeps people who are a part of your church who are regular attenders engaged when they can't be there, whether they're traveling or sick, or there's just something happening that they can't be there with you. And we didn't have that 10 years ago, but they can stay engaged wherever they're at. The second side of the video content is that it really is the front door to your church now, way before your physical front door. So people are getting online and watching a service, checking out your video content, getting a sense of who you are through video long before they step foot in your church. They're actually making a decision to attend your church, whether or not, depending on how they respond to that video. So that video content strategy is incredibly important for churches, and I think it needs to be a increased focus for many churches. We need to do it well, and we need to do it specifically in a way that's designed to help people who aren't part of our church yet engage for the first time. Mm-hmm. All right, so transitioning just a little bit, if we're going to do this engagement piece, we need to know somehow that we're winning. We need to have some way to kind of gauge this. So before we get to the Q&A, Tony, what are a few ways that church leaders can know that they're winning when it comes to just engagement as a whole?
Yeah, so actually, for the sake of time, I want to just get straight to the point on this one, Sean. Yeah. And if you don't hear anything else in today's webinar, I want you to hear this: that you should be tracking engagement. but please be making sure that you're tracking both types of engagement, the engagement that happens before someone is a guest and the engagement after someone attends services for the very first time. And the reason why is this: if you have only one of those two types of engagement, your church is not going to be healthy. So as an example, and Amy alluded to this earlier, we've seen churches that are off the charts when it comes to engagement, participating in serving teams, participating in groups or Sunday school or whatever the case might be. I mean, it's almost like everybody in the church is connected in those types of opportunities. And if you were to look at it, you would say engagement is high, and it is. But the challenge is it's only one side of that equation. And because there's very little engagement with people that aren't yet part of the church is in decline. The reverse is true as well. We've run into churches, not as frequently, but we've run into churches that really have a great strategy for developing relationships and trying to reach out to people outside the walls of the church. And actually increasing that level of engagement. But then if you don't have a great spiritual formation strategy, if there's not a clear discipleship path, if you're offering all types of programming and all these events, new people of the church, they're going to get stuck and they're not going to be able to figure out what their next step needs to look like. So again, if you don't hear anything else, if you want to determine whether or not you're winning when it comes to engagement, you need to measure both engagement before people are guests and then engagement after people start to connect with your church.
Mm-hmm. Amy, what are healthy numbers that church leaders can use to benchmark against?
I think the best answer to that is just each quarter, we put out our Unstuck Church report, and that has data from hundreds of churches, all shapes and sizes. And I think it'll just give you a good idea of what other churches are measuring beyond just, the typical attendance and giving. So there's several metrics in there that you could begin to check and even test against kind of what the averages are each quarter in that report. And Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you can subscribe to get that at the unstuckgroup.com, but will you put that link up at the end of the webinar?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the unstuckgroup.com/trends.
All right.
Yeah.
But that's a good place to start. Easy place to start.
Perfect. All right. So Tony, here's the big question. Last question that I have for you. If engagement numbers in the things that we talked about are high, can we just ignore attendance? What do we do with that?
All right. So here's the second thing that I want you to take away from this webinar. The answer to that specific question is no. You can't ignore attendance. My goodness. We all, I hope we would all agree that hearing biblical teaching, participating in corporate worship, creating opportunities for engage with others, that's critical to someone's spiritual journey into spiritual formation. And so because of that, we can't just ignore attendance. We certainly want to see healthy churches not only be winning when it comes to pre-guest engagement and then post-connection engagement in our churches, but we want churches to be winning when it comes to actually attending and participating in worship every week as well. And, again, we're constantly pointing people to the podcast, I think, in this conversation today, but we just had a great conversation with Jeff Brody. Jeff is the lead pastor at Connexus Church up in Barrie, Canada, Ontario. And you need to go listen to that podcast because Jeff talked about the importance of these engagement conversations and how their church kind of shifted their strategy, both pre-guest and then post-guest, when it comes to reaching people outside the church and outside the faith. And it talked about how their strategy for really focusing on relationships with people outside the church then led to some strategies that the church implemented when people first connected with the church, which through the years not only has increased their first-time guests, but also they're seeing increases in attendance as well after several years of plateau. So I just want to encourage you as we're having this conversation. I hope that this topic of engagement helps you think about your ministry strategy a little bit differently. But I don't want this to be an excuse. Okay, now because we're winning with engagement, it doesn't matter what our attendance is. We still need to be focused on increasing our reach even on Sunday mornings. And I think with that, are we ready for next steps?
Yes,
Yeah, so
I think we are.
Here's what we're going to do. We're going to jump into live Q&A here in a moment. And Mark, thanks a lot for bringing in all these questions for us from the chat. Several of you submitted questions beforehand. I'm looking at the list, and I know we're not going to address all of these, but we'll try to go through as many of them as we can in the remaining moments we have. Before we get to the Q&A, though, I wanted you to know that we've been referring to a lot of stats in today's conversation, and all of that information and a lot more is included in our Church Engagement Report 2019. And if you have registered for the webinar today, you're going to get a copy of that. And so make sure you look for that in your inbox. We'll make sure you get that as well. And as always, we're always looking for opportunities for our team to be serving your church when it comes to increasing engagement or just church health generally. And if you're interested in that, we'd love to start a conversation with you related to that as well. So with that, let's turn to the Q&A section here. And let's see here. Let me preview the first question. Then I'll decide Sean or Amy or if I'm going to take them. You know how this works. I give you the hard question.
That's what I was thinking.
Got it.
Yeah. Amy, this one is related to serving. And since you talked about that, I'm going to let you take this one first. Does the nature of the serving, whether it's internal within the church or externally in the community, have an impact when it comes to engagement?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think we need to be strategic with how we craft our internal roles, how we serve within the body, but it's not unusual at all for teams to have outreach teams, both local and global, that are very strategic and aligned with the discipleship pathway to engage people in serving. And different serving opportunities are going to be more interesting or less interesting depending on who you are. So I think having both of those really casts a wider net to those that you're trying to engage in the life of your church.
Sean, I'll let you take a first crack at this next question, and then we may be able to tag team on this as well. But the question is this: how do you measure specifically engagement of people before they attend your church? Yeah,
that's such a great question, because it's really difficult to get a sense of these people who aren't connected to us and in our environments yet. How do we even know that they have some sort of early connection point with us? And so I think this does come back to the content strategy and why it's so important, because as you talked about, Tony, we're trying to create content really that helps people's lives and eventually helps them take a step. And everybody's step looks very different. So people who aren't connected to your church yet, their step is going to look very different than someone who's been a part of your church for a long, long time. And that first step may just be engaging with the content that you're putting out there. We talked on the podcast about how churches can be leveraging things like a podcast to really connect with people before they're ever part of the church. So the great thing about all of those digital engagement formats is that there are easy ways to track how people are engaging and who's engaging with those. Not ways to know their mailing address and their birth date and their social security number, but ways to know whether they're engaging or not. And so I just encourage churches to explore that, everything from podcasting to blogging to all the digital content that they could put out there to connect before anyone ever steps foot in the church. What are your thoughts, Tony?
Yeah, and including email. I mean, we tend to forget about email, but and on our team, there's probably, I think the last report I saw, 25 to 30,000 people that we're connected to, that we're engaged with as a ministry before people take a first step to actually use the services, the offerings that the Unstuck group provides. And so there are a lot of different ways that we can measure how people are engaging with our content. And obviously the opportunity there is to see a trend of growth in each of those areas. And if we see that growth happening, we know we're winning when it comes to that engagement before someone's a guest. Amy, any other thoughts from you on that, or should we jump ahead to the next question?
I
Just
just
the
a
next question.
just
Oh,
a
go ahead, Sean.
yeah, just a quick, really practical. For instance, there are databases that you can use and ways to know if you send somebody an email, if they open it, engage with it, and how many times they open and engage with it. And that's not getting into their personal info, and that's not tracking them in a creepy way. It's just knowing what content was helpful to them and how do I send them more content. And churches can be leveraging that.
That's right. All right. I'll take this one. To what extent is a church management system or database required to track and drive engagement? Do growing churches create systems for follow-up with digital engagement? So actually, I'll take the first question. The answer to that is yes, obviously. You need to have some database, not multiple databases, where you're tracking people's next steps. And so the better, by the way, that your content strategy can integrate with that database, it's going to help you make sure you're actually seeing the engagement before someone is a guest. But then once they connect to your church, then you can see then the traction that you have with your existing spiritual formation strategy, whatever that looks like. But how are you taking somebody from the guest experience to actual connection, actual engagement in your churches? And this is why we need one database that everybody in the church is using rather than different databases, different spreadsheets. I mean, I walked into a church recently, I think they had 6 or 8 different mechanisms for tracking people. And that worked well for each of the individual teams, but it didn't work well when it came to actually understanding, does our strategy of reaching people and then connecting people, is it working? Because there was no way to measure that. The second part of that question, again, was related to systems for digital engagement. And Sean, actually, we've talked a little bit about this, and it bleeds into the next question too, about capture rates for first-time guests. Someone was asking about, we use connection cards, we check, the kids check in, they're actually using a QR code on their bulletin for people to identify they're a guest. But texting is also a system that we're seeing churches using when it comes to identifying first-time guests.
Yeah, we've had a lot of churches that we've worked with that have had incredible success with texting, and we've been spending some time digging into that a little bit and just recorded a podcast, like we mentioned earlier, about it, that comes out in a couple of weeks. Really, I think part of the big challenge is if somebody's at your church for the first time, they don't know what they don't know about you. And they're not really as concerned about you as much as they're concerned about themselves. What do they think of all these tattoos on my body? What do they think about the way I dressed? I just assume that I'm in a church and they're judging me to some extent. So to go to an info center to meet some person that I don't know to get some gift that you really didn't tell me about doesn't really move the needle for me. So if there's an impersonal way, a way that I can connect with you on this thing that I have in my hand 24 hours a day, which is my phone, then there's the likelihood that I'm actually going to raise my hand and say, hey, I was here today, increases dramatically. And that's what we've seen in churches. So there are several services out there that will help churches create a texting option for their first-time guests. And really, the key here is we want the guests who are there for the very first time just to say hi, to let us know that they're there, and then to create a mechanism where we can follow up with them. So next Friday, we can send a text directly to their phone to say, we're so glad that you were here last week with us. Come join us again this week. It's just an underutilized tool that churches have access to.
Very good. Thanks, Sean. We'll have the upcoming podcast. We'll have more on that as well. Let's see. Amy, we'll let you take a crack at this one. If a new guest attends and you want to measure engagement, is the standard within 3 months, 6 months, a year? Kelly's curious. It doesn't say where Kelly's from. I feel like we should be saying, this is Kelly from Timbuktu. I'm not sure where she's from, but any standard that we should be looking for on how long it takes for a guest to actually engage, to connect?
Boy, well, we would hope that they would engage inside of 3 months. So for me, I don't know what you think, Tony, but I would think that would be the maximum kind of limit, that we've got good engagement strategies that hopefully help them come back, whether it's the next week or within 4 weeks. I think would be a win for the church, given people's schedule and what regular attendance looks like these days. But I would think you get past 3 months and they're sort of off the radar. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I would. And this is too where I highlighted earlier. If you have a great experience for guests on Sunday morning with your service, your hospitality teams, I mean the facilities, the signage, your follow-up process, you'll be winning if you get 20% of those first-time guests to eventually connect to your church. But here's what's fascinating. It increases to 40% for second-time guests, and then 60% for third-time guests. And so I think rather than the question Kelly is asking about how long does it take for people to engage and to connect, I think the higher priority should be just getting people to come back for a second and third visit. Because what the data shows is if we do that effectively, then the engagement will eventually happen. And that's where the ultimate win is.
Yeah, I probably answered the front part of that question. Agree with you. And I'm just going to plug the texting option one more time.
Yeah.
If you give people an easy next step to send a text to say I was here, you've got an opportunity to appropriately drop them a text back, just inviting them in those weeks that follow. That would hopefully get them back. And I think once they've come back a few times, you'll just give them time to engage. It'll take a little bit. They're processing a lot. They're learning a lot. They're experiencing a lot. So you've got a little bit of grace after you get them to at least come back a few times.
It's funny, back when I started in ministry, sending postcards or letters to guests was how you followed up with them. And then phone calls was how you followed up with them. And then email was how you followed up with them. The reality is none of those three options work anymore. So if you're going to find something, if you're going to try something that works, you need to text people. That's how people communicate these days.
We had Tony. We had along the line those lines. Greg on our chat asked: Is going to the house of a first-time guest to give a gift creepy?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. In 2019, yes.
Yes. Especially my house. Okay. Let's see. We'll go with Sean. Since you're the closest thing to a young professional in this conversation.
Hey, wait a minute.
Is there a better time for young professionals out of college but no kids to gather on Sunday morning, other than Sunday morning? Attendance for that group seems to be a little erratic on Sundays.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think it depends on your church and who your mission field is, really. I do have a friend who has a church, and the church, really, their mission field is young adults who are connected to Notre Dame University, which I live near. And they've been incredibly successful with a Thursday night service that reaches really that crowd, students who are attending Notre Dame. And on the weekends are very busy with studying and other things, but Thursday night is just a great time for them. Now, obviously, Thursday night at 7 o'clock is not a great time for families, for parents with young kids. You're getting close to bedtime there. It's probably a school night during the school year, and so that time's not going to work. So I do think you have to be very clear on who your mission field is and who specifically you're trying to reach before you make that decision. Some churches will try to take a missional step and step out and do a different service time with a totally different mission field in mind. But man, you really have to be doing incredibly focused ministry with your current mission field to even take that step first. I would not do that until you feel like you've really got the mission field that you're primarily focused on, that is working really, really well. So I think it comes back to the church's focused mission field.
Very good. Amy, I'm going to give you this last one. And since you've worked with some very large churches, this is appropriate for you. This church is well over 5,000 in attendance and are asking, what are the effective ways to handle leads that turn cold for unknown reasons in a large church setting? So people, indicate some interest in connecting with the church and maybe even take a first or second step, but then they fade away for whatever reason. So one example that this person provided is, let's say it's someone that was connected in a small group for just a short time and now they're not around. What should churches do, or is there anything that churches can do about that?
Yeah, well, it's not there's not obviously a really easy answer to that question other than one church I was just working with this past weekend. I think their guest connection, they just had a really good process. They have, I'll just call it a dream team. That's not what they're called. But whenever there's someone new, and they've got a process for how they connect with new people, this volunteer team, let's say you just come through my church doors, Tony, and you're like, hey, I got your text. I was supposed to come meet so-and-so. I would connect you with someone, maybe Jim from the dream team is what they're doing. And now it's Jim's job to stay connected with you until you actually take a next step on the discipleship pathway, which for them is a small group. And then that pass off happens. And now the small group leader is really the shepherd for that person. And so once they're in a small group and they're connected to a small group leader, those relationships form. And so I just thought it was a really intentional strategy, taking people from that I'm just starting to attend to now I've actually taken a step into your discipleship process. And I assume if they would have gotten connected in serving first, it would have been that serving leader to do that. So I don't know exactly how you pursue someone who's come off the radar, but I would look at your systems to go, do we have a process that helps these people truly become known and have begun building relationships? Or do they just feel like they plugged into the machine and into the grind, and then so they don't have any ownership in a sense? They just kind of, the typical kick the tires and then they disappeared. It'd be sort of weird for you to over pursue them. I would instead be intentional about what's happening in those front pieces of that process so that you can develop a relationship with them.
That's exactly where my mind went, Amy, too. It really is. It comes back to relationships before people become guests, but then it's all about connecting people relationally after they start showing up to the church as well. All right. Sean, thank you. Amy, thank you. Mark, Tiffany, Caroline, thank you behind the scenes for everything that you've done. Thank you for participating in today's conversation. We've mentioned a number of resources through the discussion today. I just wanted to let you know we'll be emailing you with all of those resources, including, it sounds like an opportunity to see the webinar all over again, because I know it was so compelling. You just want to watch it again or share it with a friend. So we'll be sure to do that. We'll also try to follow up on all the questions we didn't get to today on the webinar. In fact, you can still ask questions. Feel free to share those questions on social media. Just use the hashtag UnstuckChurch, or you can email us at help@theunstuckgroup.com. And then again, if you're interested, we want to help your churches get healthy, reach more people, improve engagement. We want to do that, and we're working with hundreds of churches across the country. We'd love to do that with your church as well. In fact, if you just jump on our website and there's a get started form, we just want to start the conversation with you. In fact, if you're lucky, Sean will be the person that you get to talk to, right, Sean?
That's right.
All right. Very good. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you at a future webinar with the Unstuck Group.